I thought I knew my wife. Until the day I discovered she wasn't where she said she was. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks, and it wasn't until I confronted her with the proof that she finally admitted it. But what happened next shook me to my core. Daniel had always trusted Maria. They were about to welcome their first child into the world, a baby girl who was already the center of their plans and dreams. At 32, Maria was glowing with the excitement of pregnancy, and Daniel couldn't imagine his life without her. She talked about their future together constantly, how they'd raise their daughter, how perfect everything was going to be. But lately, things didn't feel right. Then one day, something happened that would change everything. It started with the small, almost unnoticeable things. Maria, who was usually so chatty and open, began spending more and more time on her phone. At first, Daniel thought it was no big deal. She was just scrolling through social media, or maybe catching up with friends. But it started happening more often, late into the night, long after they'd both settled into bed. She'd be texting or typing away, her face lit by the glow of her screen. Sometimes, Daniel would wake up in the middle of the night and see her phone still in her hand, her eyes glued to it. When he asked her who she was texting so late, she'd always brush it off, saying it was just work or a friend asking about the baby. But it wasn't just the phone. Maria started to withdraw. She wasn't as talkative as she used to be. She seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. They used to spend hours talking about their future, their baby, the life they were about to build together. Now, she'd barely say a word at dinner, her thoughts somewhere else. Sometimes, Daniel would look over at her and catch her staring off into space, like she was lost in thought, or maybe just avoiding eye contact. Then there were the checkups. It was normal for Maria to have regular visits to the doctor, but lately, she'd been leaving earlier than usual, saying she had a routine checkup or an appointment with a friend. She would leave in the morning, telling Daniel she'd be back in a few hours. But more often than not, she came back later than expected, sometimes hours late. She never really gave a clear explanation for the delay. At first, Daniel told himself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe her doctor's office was busy. Daniel tried to ignore it at first, convincing himself that it was all just stress, or that maybe he was overthinking things. But over time, the small signs piled up. The late-night texts, the quiet distance between them, the unexplained absences, all of it started to eat at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was changing in their relationship, and he couldn't put his finger on what it was. One afternoon, Maria told Daniel that she had a routine medical checkup to attend. This wasn't unusual, she'd been to several appointments already, and he had no reason to doubt her. They were expecting their first child, so it made sense for her to keep up with the doctor's visits. Daniel gave her a quick kiss as she left the house, and everything seemed normal. But as soon as the door clicked shut behind her, something nagged at the back of his mind. It wasn't a strong feeling, but just a tiny voice that told him to check. He shook it off, thinking he was just overthinking things. But then he remembered something small, but important. Maria's iPhone had a feature that shared her location with him. It wasn't a secret, she'd set it up herself, just in case they needed to find each other quickly. It wasn't about spying or invading privacy. They had both agreed to it for safety. If one of them was stuck in traffic or needed help, it was just easier to know where the other person was. It was a simple convenience. Still, Daniel couldn't help but feel an uneasy curiosity. Pulling out his phone, he opened the location app. Normally, Maria's phone would be at the hospital during these checkups, so Daniel expected to see a little pin on the map marking the hospital's location. But this time, when he checked, the map didn't show the hospital at all. Instead, it showed a quiet, residential neighborhood on the other side of town. A place Daniel didn't recognize. He stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. The hospital was at least a 15-minute drive away from this spot, and none of Maria's friends lived anywhere near here. His stomach twisted. Why was she not at the hospital like she said? Was she lying? He tried to brush it off, but his thoughts began to race. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe there was a simple explanation. But deep down, something didn't feel right. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than she was telling him. So, he decided to keep an eye on things. Over the next few weeks, after every checkup, Daniel checked her location again. And sure enough, every time Maria went to a medical appointment, her phone ended up in the same place, a quiet street in a part of town he didn't recognize. The pattern was clear. Maria was hiding something, and Daniel knew he had to find out what it was. One evening, after another medical visit, Daniel decided to follow Maria. He knew where she was going now, and his heart pounded as he drove to the location. When he arrived, he found a spot and kept an eye on his wife's car. Finally, they came out after hours. He saw Maria coming outside, laughing, talking to a man Daniel didn't recognize. The man was tall, well-built, with a charming smile. They exchanged some words, and then he wrapped his arms around Maria, pulling her in for a kiss. Daniel couldn't believe his eyes. His wife, his pregnant wife, was kissing another man. He felt a rush of anger and hurt, but he forced himself to stay hidden. He couldn't confront her now, he needed proof. Daniel snapped several photos from a distance, careful not to be seen. His hands were shaking as he zoomed in on the man's face, taking clear shots of Maria and her lover together. Afterward, Daniel did some digging. He reached out to a few people in their circle and managed to find out the man's name, Chris. A colleague of Maria's, someone she'd met at work. Daniel discovered that the two had been exchanging intimate texts for months. They'd even made plans to meet up secretly. It was clear that Maria had been hiding her affair with Chris for some time. Daniel's stomach turned. His wife was betraying him. But he wasn't going to confront her just yet. He needed all the evidence, and he knew this was just the beginning. A few days later, Maria came home late from a meeting she'd had with some friends. She was all smiles, chatting about work and how things were going. Daniel acted like everything was normal, but inside, his mind was racing. He knew he couldn't keep this secret any longer. Daniel's hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let her see how much this hurt, at least, not yet. This moment had been coming for weeks, maybe even months, and now, it was finally time. He walked into the living room, the photos he'd taken of Maria and Chris clenched tightly in his hand. He didn't need to say a word, he just held them up in front of her. The change in Maria's face was instant. Her confident smile faltered, her eyes growing wide as she stared at the pictures. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, she was speechless. "What is this?" Maria stammered, trying and failing to hide the panic in her voice. Her usual composure was gone, replaced with nervousness. Daniel didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, controlled. "It's exactly what it looks like, Maria. You've been seeing someone else. Chris, right?" Maria's eyes flickered with fear as she shook her head. "No, Daniel, that's not what it looks like," she protested weakly. Her voice cracked as she continued. "You're misunderstanding. Don't lie to me," Daniel cut her off, his patience wearing thin. His voice had hardened, each word carrying the weight of all the nights he'd spent wondering, questioning. "I know everything. The texts. The secret meetings. The kisses. It's all right here." Maria's face drained of color. She opened her mouth again, but the words got stuck in her throat. She looked as if she was trying to come up with something, anything, to explain, but there was no excuse left. She muttered something about it being a misunderstanding, about feeling lonely or neglected. Maybe she was just looking for someone to talk to. But none of it made sense. None of it changed the fact that she had betrayed him. Daniel wasn't listening to her excuses anymore. He didn't want to hear her try to justify it. His heart felt like it was being squeezed, but he had to stay strong. He knew what he had to do next. "Give me your phone, Maria," he said, his voice low and firm. Maria's eyes flashed with panic, and for a moment, she hesitated. "No, Daniel, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't wait for her to finish. His patience was gone. Now. Without another word, he reached for her phone. Maria tried to pull away, but Daniel was faster. He grabbed the phone from her hands, his fingers tightening around it like a vice. He unlocked it in one swift motion, ignoring the pleas in her eyes. He scrolled through her messages, the proof staring back at him with each new text. There it was, every message, every flirtatious exchange, every intimate word. Maria had been seeing Chris behind his back for months. Her messages were full of love, desire, promises of a future together. Each one was a dagger to his chest. His stomach twisted in knots as he read through them, each word cutting deeper than the last. How could she do this? How could she betray him like this? Maria stood there, her face flushed with shame. Her hands were trembling. She could no longer pretend. The photos, the texts, the lies, they were all laid bare. There was nothing left to say. Maria opened her mouth to say something, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to listen. He didn't need to hear her explanations or apologies anymore. The words she was about to say wouldn't change what he knew. She could beg for forgiveness all she wanted, but the damage had been done. He couldn't undo the betrayal. With a hard step forward, Daniel's voice cracked, raw and thick with disbelief. "Why, Maria? Why would you do this to me? To us? We were about to have a baby together. How am I supposed to believe the child you're carrying is even mine?" Maria's eyes flooded with tears. She stammered through a broken apology, promising him the baby was his, that she never meant for things to spiral out of control. She told him how she had felt neglected during the pregnancy, how his constant work took him away from her when she needed him the most. In her mind, her affair with Chris was an escape, a way to fill the emptiness she felt. Maybe that explanation, to her, justified everything. But for Daniel, it wasn't enough. Her excuses fell flat. Maria had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone or erased. He stared at her, the pain and betrayal tightening in his chest. "I can't do this, Maria," Daniel said, his voice steady but strained, each word like it physically hurt to speak. "I can't raise a child with someone who's been lying to me. Someone who has betrayed my trust like this. I'll have to wait until this baby's born to get a DNA test, just to be sure." Maria's sobs grew louder, but Daniel didn't flinch. She begged him to forgive her, promised she'd fix everything, that she would change. But Daniel couldn't bring himself to believe her anymore. He couldn't ignore what she'd done, no matter how many times she said she was sorry. The trust was gone. The relationship was shattered beyond repair. "You have a choice, Maria," he said. "You can go be with Chris, the man you chose over me. Or you can stay and try to fix this, but don't expect me to forget what you've done. Because I can't. Not after this." Maria crumpled in front of him, her face streaked with tears. She had no words left to fix the damage, no way to undo what was done. Daniel turned his back on her, his resolve hardening with every step. He knew it was over. The woman he had loved, the woman he'd planned to start a family with, had betrayed him. There was nothing left for him here. As Daniel walked out of the room, a sense of finality settled over him. His chest was tight, and the weight of everything that had happened hit him hard. He was done, there was no going back. If the paternity test confirmed that the baby was his, he would raise the child on his own, but he wasn't going to stay in a marriage built on lies. Maria's betrayal had destroyed everything. Before leaving, he took a moment to gather his thoughts and sent a long, clear message to Maria's parents. He included the photos, the texts, and everything he had discovered about the affair. He explained that he was ending the marriage and wouldn't be continuing their relationship. As he hit send, he felt a strange sense of relief, but also uncertainty. The next few days would be difficult, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to allow her lies to control his life any longer.